of two webinars, which NEDLAC is organizing together with MISTRA, focusing firstly on what we've called the social contract between citizens and residents and government, and the second, where we're focusing on social partnership between stakeholders and social partners in South Africa. So we're doing this. Sorry, my name is Lisa Septel. I'm the head of NEDLAC. I think since about March last year, I've been chairing a meeting eventually became every Tuesday, every second Tuesday at the same time, to coordinate the response of the NEDLAC social partners to the COVID pandemic. And we felt, as organized business, labor, community, and government, that we should wind up the NEDLAC response in, could I say, an elegant way. And what we want to do in this elegant way is to learn the lessons from the COVID pandemic, as well as see the extent to which we can leave a legacy. And then we decided to partner with MISTRA, because one of the things that one of our participants has often said is that we shouldn't be talking to ourselves. And so we thought that we should talk and engage with a broader audience and broader number of participants as we reflect on our experience. And so in these two webinars, we've both tried to mix participants. Some of the people who'll be presenting have been an integral part of the NEDLAC processes, and others have been less integral, and others have really been observing us from the outside. And secondly, we thought that as we reflect and in our discussion, we should get perspectives from those of us who've been part of the process, as well as, again, others who have not been part of the process. So welcome to those of you who've been on this journey. I see a number of familiar names, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us in this reflection process. So maybe just to say that we hope that out of this process, there's a number of different kinds of events, the two webinars and some other reflection events. We will do what is called in NEDLAC a NEDLAC report with recommendations, which we would then table to relevant government departments and ministers, and also, if relevant, to the other NEDLAC social partners. And we've also tried to look at the COVID experience through a different prism, because the lessons of COVID are not only lessons about health, they're also lessons about how we in South Africa as social partners and stakeholders can tackle the key crises that we face. So I'm really just introducing this webinar. We have asked Dr. Yaqub Omar from MISTRA, the Chief Operating Officer of MISTRA, to facilitate this session. So let me hand over to Abba. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you on behalf of the Mapungubwe Institute, the privilege of sharing this really important and critical reflection. I hope everyone's warm and settled in, and you've got your cups of coffee or tea at hand, and your muffins or rusk or whatever we resorted to having on our own. One day, I hope that soon we can start having these kind of sessions more physically, so that we can get to know each other better. There's no doubt that the whole period of the COVID-19, the past couple of years, has placed a lot of strains on our society and our economy and our communities and our families. And what we need to do is, as we feel like we're beginning to get to a kind of post-COVID situation, we need to start understanding what are the challenges we face in getting out of this. So I think that today's topic is quite relevant to the question of at the societal and community level, and that is looking at the processes around social contracting, around trust, and around adherence to protocols and rules and so forth. Now, the National Development Plan, I think, may be a useful starting point as far as what a social contract is. It says that it is an agreement that outlines the mutual rights and responsibilities of citizens, their government, and other institutions in society. Many of us have asked, especially recently, whether the social contract has been broken. As inequality has increased, as people feel less and less safe, crime has increased, and then more and more violent protests have been occurring, and where people have begun questioning whether whether we're in a failing state or there is a failure in the state itself. The founding of our democracy on a negotiated constitution is our social contract, and it has been threatened by attacks on the constitution, violent unrest, and the inability of the state to protect its citizens. Hand in hand with that has been the question of trust. And this is really germane to the discussion we'd be having today when looking at responses to COVID-19. The Institute of Justice and Reconciliation has emphasized that trust needs to be seen at two levels: the vertical, between state and citizenry, and the horizontal, that is, relations among citizens. Now, there have been a number of factors that have been cited as contributing to the kind of decline in trust that the Afrobarometer has been tracking over the past few years, and in particular over the last few years. Corruption has been seen as one of the factors most directly impacting on trust across vertical and horizontal level. In South Africa, national and local government recorded the highest number of reported cases of corruption, with the private sector's involvement increasing to about 15% over the past few years. In 2020, anything up to about 36 to 40% of South Africans indicated little or no trust in people from other racial groups than their own. So we're finding the challenge both at the vertical level and as well as the horizontal level. And at the horizontal level, while corruption at the vertical level is the biggest factor, horizontally, inequality is the most divisive feature of society, and thus contributing to lack of trust. So the questions that our speakers and participants have been asked to address include: what do we think is behind the initial strong adherence to rules in the beginning of the COVID-19 response and the change of attitude over the past 2 years? What do you think is behind the high and vocal levels to criticism and opposition to vaccination, resulting in South Africa not meeting its target, leading to the destruction of up to 8 million vaccine doses? What should the state and social partners be doing to build the social contract going forward, especially in respect of public health and economic recovery? So we've got a really great list of people that will be addressing us on these topics. And to get us started, I'd like to call upon David Harrison, who's the CEO of the DJ Murray Trust, who will be speaking about studies done into behavioral change during the COVID pandemic. David, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Yakub. I think my screen should now be visible to everybody. And thanks very much for the invitation to present to you and to everybody this morning. So I'd like to just share some of the strengths, some of my perceptions, I guess, of the strengths and failings of social contracting. In the first year, I was very much involved in providing foundation support in the procurement of PPE, particularly to community level workers, extensive communications campaign, food relief, etc., largely through civil society support. And then in the past year had been providing direct sort of intersectoral and multi-funder support directly to the vaccination program. So that's really where I was coming from. I just a couple of reflections, a bit of a context, just before we turn to the specific recommendations and reflections. And the first is that we faced a massive tragedy in South Africa. I mean, where it ends up, if we take into account excess deaths, we basically had about a third extra deaths, excess deaths happening in South Africa per year. So in other words, instead of 3 people, for every 3 people who typically would die in a year, during 2020 and 2021, we had 4 people die in a year. So that's huge. An optimal vaccination program in the context of South Africa should have started 3 months earlier, because the greatest impact in terms of morbidity, hospitalizations, in terms of mortality, happened during the Delta wave. We got to 50% of 50 pluses around about September the 12th. Imagine if we'd managed to achieve that 3 months earlier. Having said all of that, one of the things we did get right was a fairly age-differentiated response. Age-differentiated prioritization for vaccination. So we have seen that older people came forward quicker, and now about 70% of people over 60 have had at least 1 dose. So that was a positive, but certainly missed opportunities. When we tried to anticipate what was going to happen, and this was a graph that we came up with back in about May, June 2021. So really towards the beginning of the vaccination program for the general population. And we'd said, well, there's going to be a percentage of people who come forward because they want to be vaccinated. Then there are going to be those that are hesitant and will be open to persuasion. Then there are going to be people who are willing to get vaccinated, but there are personal costs, there are other constraints, there are contextual trade-offs, the realities of life that they face. And then obviously there are going to be people unwilling and resistant. And fortunately, there had been so many studies done over a short period of time that we could actually start to predict quite quickly. I'm talking about the NIDSCRAM survey, the work done by UJ, the work done a little bit later by University of Cape Town, by Soldru. And we sort of estimated right back then that we would probably get to just under a half of our adult population having at least first dose coverage before things started to get harder, before we would have to really try and address not only issues of communication, but also the transactional costs that people were facing. Well, we were pretty accurate. And this really was based on the evidence already coming out of the research. What we didn't think about, what we didn't predict right back then was the time duration. This was sort of an effort curve, but in fact, the time needed to get to 50% was higher than we had expected. We're now sitting over here, where we're in the amber, we're in the red zone, where it's going to be harder and harder to get more people to get vaccinated, particularly because we have moved out of the zone of those that are willing into the zone where there are other factors that are holding people back. Now, having said all of that, I mean, we need to, I think, acknowledge the work done in terms of communication that did keep people coming through the door. We saw sort of a steady number of people coming through after the massive sort of bursts associated with the opening of each of the successive age groups. But we have to also say that demand-side interventions, and we threw a lot at it over the course of a year, demand-side interventions actually had very modest effects. You'll remember the Vuma weekends that we tried. That probably accounted for an extra 500,000 doses. We were certainly hoping for at least 1 million there. Then when we were keen to try and get older people to come forward for vaccination, and it was sort of flattening off, plateauing at about 60%, we introduced the 200 Rand Vuma voucher incentive. That brought in, and the work that's been done, work that's been done basically showing that about a 10% effect of that Vuma voucher incentive. And then the youth campaign that we put in place, Keredi, a bit later, within the first 2 weeks, probably accounting for an extra 251,000 vaccinations. So some evidence of effect, but really small in the context of what needed to be achieved. These sort of demand side interventions paled into insignificance compared to the broader contextual factors that Jacob has just spoken about. And just to give you an idea, I mean, if you see here, we were in the red here, and this is from about the 8th of September right through to the 9th of June. The red line is first dose vaccinations. The blue line is total vaccinations. So we saw that we settled in at a first dose vaccination rate in September, October, at about 100,000 per day. Then came the local government elections. And quite remarkably, we saw a 25% reduction in first dose vaccinations, almost, well, literally from the day of that election, only to have that spike once the sort of Omicron scare came in, and then a significant reduction when people realized that Omicron wasn't as bad as they thought. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's the larger national and contextual sentiment at play rather than specific health-specific interventions and communication that I think had the bigger effect overall. The other point that's really important for us to note is the social gradient of uptake, which is really, really stark. Those people earning less than 1,000 Rand a month, far less likely to be vaccinated, even though a high percentage of them are favorable. So 40% of people who earn less than 1,000 Rand a month say they're willing to get vaccinated, but haven't yet been vaccinated. Whereas vaccination rates among wealthier people, far, far higher, even though they made a lot of noise saying they were not going to get vaccinated. And this is something that was anticipated. And again, we were not successful in overcoming that social gradient of uptake. Now, where we sort of ended up is that slowly as things rolled out, the various key functions of a national COVID-19 response and vaccination response started to come into play. Initially, it started with sort of policy formulation, with media, and with the sort of logistical process of getting public and private service provision in place. It was only later, really, that enough attention was paid to issues of research, data analytics and reporting, social mobilization at every level, accountability monitoring, and I would argue that if we're going to learn anything from this pandemic for the next, it's that we should be anticipating all of these key functions that need to be in place from day one. Provision of funding in itself is not sufficient. There must be mechanisms of beneficiating that funding, of using that funding effectively in the context of a pandemic. So part of what we need to do is really map out what these key functions are and ensure that there is an effective mechanism in place going forward. So my final slide, sort of lessons for social contracting that perhaps need to be considered for the way forward. The first is that when trust really counts, the language of war is counterproductive. We saw that the language of war gave forward a sort of a signaling that resulted in a sort of fairly jackboot approach, extreme sort of martial approach, even if it wasn't intended. It resulted in some ludicrous regulations being put in place. When coupled with sort of the corruption we saw with PPE and with the digital vibes, etc., it just once again increased sort of community resentment and mistrust. And when finally we all accepted that, look, we're not going to get on top of this simply with a logistical exercise, expecting everybody to line up and just give them the jab. We require public participation. We were already too far down the road in terms of resentment and mistrust. And so the National Disaster Management Act in fact, contemplates a far more sort of benign terminology. It speaks of management structures. It speaks of head of management. I couldn't see referral to these command and control councils, command centers, war rooms, really in the context of a public health epidemic. It's not appropriate, and it turned out to be counterproductive. The second is, and it's related to this, is that we need to be planning both for supply and demand from day one. As I've said, identify the key response functions, design the social contract accordingly, understanding that demand is as critical as the logistics component that needs to be in place. The third is that we saw the establishment of the Solidarity Fund, funding rolled in, but there needs to be an activator, implementer mechanism, particularly when we're talking about the design of specific new interventions or bespoke interventions needed to respond to that disaster. We found it very helpful. A DGMT coordinated support from a number of donors into the department, and actually helped to set up some key initiatives such as the National Contact Center. That effector mechanism that we just put in place quickly needs to be contemplated as part of the mechanism going forward, rather than simply the mobilization of funding, because we know that mobilization of funding without that effector mechanism led to additional corruption. The fourth point I want to make is that setting up integrated implementing structures, cross-sectional structures, bringing together business, labor, civil society, a government can be very, very effective. We set up a demand acceleration task team. That task team comprised people from business, from labor, government, civil society. And that meant that we didn't have to then go with our ideas to labor and ask them to implement it. The COSATU representatives who were part of the demand acceleration task team could then take it back through the national and provincial and local structures. And we saw high uptake, we know, for example, for the Vuma weekends on some of the mines as a consequence. And finally, even as we're so focused on the immediate concern, we need to be thinking about how we set precedents and pathways for the future. Keep the future in mind. For example, the mobile outreach vaccination teams had a much higher uptake of vaccination than fixed facilities, which provides us with a model, perhaps, for reaching young people in informal settlements who don't come into health services. So think future, even as we focused on the present. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David, and you are perfectly on time. So just a reminder to the rest of our speakers, you have 15 minutes to present. So whilst Mabalane is coming on, I'm going to give him a moment. I just want to reiterate one of the figures that I was referring to, and that is that, according to the most recent Afrobarometer's gauge of public perception of corruption, 64% answered yes to the question, over the past year, has the level of corruption in this country increased? Almost half said that it had increased a lot. Faith in the government to combat corruption is low. A majority, about 60%, said it's performing very badly, and 15% answered fairly badly. Only 21% gave a positive view. It gives me great pleasure to now call up to the podium as such, Mabalane Mfundisi of the Community Trust. Is a co-convener of the Community COVID-19 front. We have also been
Abba, we're struggling to hear you.
Okay, maybe I think Mabalane, if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
Can you unmute Mabalane?
No, thank you, Abba and colleagues. It is also my pleasure on behalf of the Community Constituency Front to contribute our voice to this particular that we have traveled. And as President Mandela, in his many speeches, when he said that, once you have traveled a long journey and you think you have arrived, take a moment at a particular vista, then you discover that there is still a long journey going forward. So mine will just speak about the work that we have done as the Community Constituency Front. And I have a lot of slides, but I have just reduced them for your pleasure to one slide. So if I am able to share, let me just go to the it's just on one slide, because these things with PowerPoint, the more you page through, the more time you take. And the chair said that we have 10 minutes. So just in terms of the Community Constituency Front, we were confronted with what we didn't know in the form of COVID. And on the 23rd of March 2020, it is on the evening that the President announced the measures that would be put in place, including what we were all not accustomed to, which was things that we were seeing in movies, that we will be locked down in our houses and have to go nowhere. So on the 23rd, we engaged at a civil society engagement. The SANAC, the overall convener of NEDLEC, Tulani Chefuta, also joined us. And we agreed on a pact to work together. As colleagues are aware, that NEDLEC community constituency is expanding its reach to other networks of civil society. So they reached out to us and gave us the mandate as SANAC Civil Society Forum to lead on the establishment of the Community Constituency Front that brought a lot of organization together. In our quest to contribute, we were met with some challenges because it was a lockdown, but we needed to establish a nerve center. We made some decisions that in retrospect, if we're to be confronted with a similar challenge, we'll only make those decisions when we have the resources. We were looking at our work being very important. We felt and thought that government would support it, as well as Solidarity Fund to engage with Dr. Jorgen Pillay, amongst others, in our quest to mobilize resources. Even though that quest did not come through initially, especially with Solidarity Fund, they later on came on board and have supported us, and we can only be grateful to the support that they have. We would have wanted more, to do more, but what they gave us enabled us to move with speed and do the things that we could do. So as the theme of yesterday said, that do what you can with what you have where you are. That's what defines the journey that we undertook as the Community Constituency Front. Of course, civil society, we come from many different places, many different persuasions. So with the community-based measures as a strategy, we agreed on 16 areas that we needed to advocate for. Amongst those was provision of water, fighting for gender-based violence, access to data, issues regarding poverty, because we had an understanding that the lockdown would bring a number of challenges that will exacerbate the challenges that South Africa was confronted with. So our Bible was based on those 16 advocacy issues, and we came together to drive those. We agreed that for us to be able to do this work, we need to be on the ground. And being on the ground required us to do these 5 key strategic areas that we have learned lessons, and we are busy documenting those particular lessons, so that if in the future we're confronted with a challenge of this nature, we are able to learn from what we had done. So the first part was giving ourselves the strategic leadership on coordinating civil society, and we engaged with the then Minister Zweli Mkhize, who through support from the departmental officials, Dr. Pillay amongst those, they agreed to establish a Ministerial Advisory Committee on Social and Behavior Change. It was a multi-sectoral platform that brought us in the community constituency and others outside of the community constituency, but all of us working in. The MEC still continues to provide, advisories to government as the voice of civil society. In us advocating for this, we didn't want to have a triumphalist arrangement where it's about us and only us alone. And, we have ensured that such an entity has, longevity, and we're happy that it continues to, provide the inputs that are required of it. Of course, it could and can still do more, but it has done what it could with what it was at its disposal, and we are very happy around it. Secondly, it was around coordination of civil society. As I have indicated, that we come from many different persuasions. Sometimes we like one another, sometimes we don't like one another, but part of our role was to ensure that irrespective of where we come from, we have a role to play, we have a role to contribute, and where we are, we're able to utilize that particular, strength that we have, because we are greater in numbers. But when we are, triumphalist and say this is our space, we will not be able to do the things that we have been able to do. As part of this, the government established the National Communications Partnership, the DATT, there was the risk communication and the community engagement, a number of platforms that were created. We ensured that through our coordination, we are there and we are present. And that ensured that the third component was expressed, which is around representation and voice. Those that we engaged with and we continue to engage with in the NCP, in the NRTT, in the RCCE, everywhere where we are, even in the subcommittees of the NRTT, we came and we used our collective experience as a voice to ensure that issues that come from the community are, understood. They are also embraced. We were not just there to throw questions, but we were part and parcel of those that were providing solutions. And we're bringing in our experience, our voice from the ground in terms of the work that through our neighborhood agents across the different districts, we're able to do so. We utilize also the platforms that we were coming from in terms of SANAC Civil Society, the C19 People's Vaccine Campaign. Everyone had a role to play and ensure that their voice was heard. Sometimes critical, but it was criticism that was ensuring that we all moved together in dealing with what we were not prepared for, what we didn't understand. And we're happy that our contribution was embraced. We were, listened to, and we also rose up to the challenge, and we were present when we were required to be present. We didn't play the role of civil society, which is sometimes disruptive and not providing solutions. We were concerned South Africans. We wanted to save lives, and the lives that have been saved include the contribution that we made through ensuring that we represent and we became the voice of our communities. But key and critical was the fourth area, which was around the work on the ground, on social mobilization, communications, public awareness, and advocacy that we embarked upon. And whilst we understood that we don't have the resources, we also understood that there were others that were better resourced, and our role was to ensure that as there was one message which was developed by government with our participation, we were part of the messengers that would then bring texture to that particular voice. We used the platforms that we had at our disposal to ensure that in the media platforms that we had access to, in the opportunities that were given to articulate issues, but also in our day-to-day work, where we used our leaders and leadership as ambassadors in driving the messages, especially in promoting, compliance with the non-pharmaceutical measures. The efforts have not yielded what we would have wanted in terms of the number of people that ultimately got infected because they dropped the ball. But in the main, we contributed. We mobilized traditional leaders. We mobilized faith sector leaders. We mobilized the youth. We mobilized traditional leaders. We mobilized people in sports, arts, and culture to ensure that we're on the ground. We participate, we use our voice, we ensure that those that don't understand are taken through why it is important to comply, why it's important to understand the measures that government was putting in place from time to time in ensuring that we deal with the challenges of COVID. But the last part was our vaccine agenda. Remember, we created these community-based measures in 2020 on the 23rd of March. At the time, we didn't know what would happen, but in our analysis, because amongst us, there are people also from the medical fraternity, people who understand these particular issues, we also said that at some point, there may be a need for some intervention through vaccines that need to be provided. So we had our own vaccine agenda. And when government came with the vaccine rollout program, we already had our views on how it should be, where things should happen. And we came to the party, we contributed as best as we could. But in the main was to be on the ground and ensure that we bring our shoulders forward in order for us to be the first to get the jab, but in getting the jab, to ensure that others understand why it is important that we also need to be vaccinated. But we also advocated for ensuring that there is no vaccine apartheid that would come with the results, in terms of our country, where access to such products can also be based on people's state in life. So we advocated for opening up of the vaccine sites, for ensuring that they get to the ground. There are mobile vaccine services, but even when supply is there, we also need to ensure demand. And our role was ensuring that we use our leverage to ensure that as many community members come to the party, take up the jab. Again, we know that the numbers that were projected in terms of people taking up vaccine are not where they are. But with what we have, where we ensured that we play a role, and we continue to play that particular role through the very many different platforms that we have to ensure that the vaccinators are available, both from government and public sector, to ensure that people who are available and have understood the need to take the jab, do take the jab. So, Chair, I don't want to go over the 10 minutes, just to say that, when the story of COVID is told, there will be a paragraph that will include the role that we have played as communities through our community constituency front. But it was not the only voice in civil society. We had the South African Council of Churches, who also had a campaign that they were driving, that brought the multi-faith sectors together. We had other colleagues from civil society who were playing many different roles to ensure that from where we were able to contribute. So great lessons have been learned. They will be curated and documented in order for us to march on the journey going forward that we tried to conquer, and to the best of our ability, we conquered. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mabalane. This is, I think your input is a really useful reminder of the thousands, if hundreds of thousands of people that were involved in this effort. So really, really appreciate it. It's a really timely reminder. So colleagues, as you've seen, David set out a broad kind of picture. We then had the community experiences that Mabalane spoke to. The next speaker would be talking about workplace experiences, and that is Simon Apple, who's the Director of Research at the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union. Can I encourage attendees to please start posting your questions in the chat so that the speakers can either respond now, or when we have the open mic session, they can be able to speak to your questions then. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Chair, and greetings to the participants in this discussion. I'm going to put my presentation on for you and hopefully navigate it properly. Let me see, has that come up yet for you?
Yeah, just use slideshow mode.
Okay, hold on one second. Just trying to navigate through this. There we go. Okay, if you can confirm you can see the slides show.
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to turn my video off then. So I'm going to try and sketch for you the work done by my trade union, the SA Clothing and Textile Workers Trade Union. I'm not going to claim to be the international authority on all of this. I think the lessons will be drawn out over a period of time. But I think, you know, what I'm going to try and do over the next 15 minutes at least is take you through some of the processes that we undertook and how we're assessing them at this point. So let me sketch the context for you first. The trade union in which I work is one of the COSATU trade unions. It's a national trade union, has around 125,000 members across the country, overwhelmingly Black working class women, you know, who tend to earn wages roughly 4,500, 5,000 Rand a month. So sort of, you know, low paid workers in an industry that is predominantly geared towards the local manufacturing pipelines, the domestic market, in domestic retail industry and state supply chain. So the reason that's important is when we had a lockdown, obviously globally we were impacted, but all the dynamics of the South African market and its lockdown impacted on the up end of the value chain, the workers that we represent. But we're also a trade union that's got a very long history of social partnership. I've been part of this game for a very long time, both at a national level, within industries, etc. We've got a very well-established set of collective bargaining processes, practices, institutions, and I'll speak to you just now about how those were mobilized, repurposed, and reshaped. And obviously, we've also got an experience in healthcare interventions, and we use those too. So we're an organization across the country with a footprint that could be mobilized. I don't want to pretend to you, you know, that life was wonderful for workers under lockdown. So you must take everything that I say with the understanding on the baseline. It was incredibly hard for workers. At the factory level, there were massive disruptions. Orders were cancelled. Factories were left in stock that they couldn't sell. Workers struggled to get money. You know, even as we started to unlock, there were problems in that, capacity problems, the inability to have 100% of workers on the shop floor at any time, rotational work that arose, reduced wages, serious impediments with the flow of UIF monies to workers, and massive distress in an industry. We lost over that period, the year of March 2020 to 2021, 15% of the workers in the formal industry were shattered. We saw massive disruption and job losses in the informal sector too, with an experience for workers of growing poverty, growing inequality, insecurity, vulnerability, and all the attendant forms of social disease. So that's the context. And then within that context, the rest of what I'll tell you now applies. I'm going to take you through very quickly 5 sections of work, which may sort of provide something of a basis for understanding what we did. Some element of anticipating the problem, something that we did around restructuring and repurposing operations, and then a set of collective bargaining tools that we use to provide protections to workers on the income front, on the job protection front, and around vaccinations. So firstly, anticipating the problem. You know, we are constantly, I think, as a country, embroiled in debate, and as as my comrade Matthew loves to be quite derisive about it. You know, debate is great and wonderful, but you know what we really need is a lot of action. And so consistently we threw at ourselves the question, what is to be done, which you know, arises from Lenin. And in our trade union, we've got an experience and a history of that. And a couple of key principles apply. It's better to anticipate rather than to react. We have developed over a long period of time an understanding that we can't simply rely either on employers or on the state. There needs to be an element of expressing and identifying and engaging our own action and agency. The fact that action and outcomes need a driver, just because one agrees on something or has an idea or everyone nods and smiles at each other, doesn't make things happen. That you and I think David illustrated this. You need an implementer and driver in a process. It's something we understood. And also the kind of crucial thing that in a moment and period of insecurity, of massive insecurity and uncertainty, people respond badly to uncertainty. Anxiety is produced in workers and citizens in general, in people in general, and providing leadership is critical for being able to continue to have some element of trust and to be able to build some element of direction and movement, etc. So the union took a decision that it needed to be take an element of leadership, even where we didn't necessarily know all the answers. So right up, you know, before we had lockdown, we had already identified, for instance, 6 pieces of work that would be the kind of broad tasks of what we would need to do over the next number of months: awareness, prevention work, working on treatment when it finally arrived, actions that would defend workers and their jobs and incomes at the workplace, promote industrialization despite the crisis, some sort of catch-all for dealing with unresolved matters. And obviously we knew we would be faced with a crisis of industrial relations, and how would we solve those? We moved very quickly. Even before we had lockdown, 90% of our shop stewards had been trained in non-pharmaceutical interventions, COVID protocols. Before lockdown, we had already had briefings through our mobilizing our organizers, through health staff, through various kind of mass meetings and briefings. We had already conducted some kind of awareness for most of our 125,000 members. We started to produce an extensive campaign of digital media, phone call resources, I'll show you in a moment, extensive press coverage that hopefully would be put into the public realm, could filter down to workers as lockdown began to emerge and our channels for communication with workers began to be limited. And so, you know, what I've got on the screen, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, is the kind of digital media we were putting out on a daily basis. What are vaccines, some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, phone hotlines we developed for workers under lockdown, phone this number to speak to doctors, to ask them questions, phone this number to speak to comrades from our banking union, SASPO, to answer some of your challenges around your accounts. Debit orders are bouncing, etc. You know, phone here to speak to special lawyers around some questions that you may have, etc., etc. So I won't take you through everything, but we had an extensive campaign for workers. One of the critical things we did is we restructured and repurposed our operations, both in the trade union space, but also in the affiliate spaces we operated. So within the trade union, as lockdown emerged, and the principle of needing clear, consistent, regular, and transparent engagement with the organization and to workers, that principle was necessary. We established, you know, something like a joint strategic council of sorts, what we called our extended national secretariats. And it became a quick space to do quick mandating on decision-making, quick feedback, but it brought in an expansive concept of who the leadership of the union was, so that more people knew more and could act faster and more flexibly to deal with challenges. We had almost 200 meetings daily, sometimes twice daily, then later on weekly as we began to have some more structure that was emerging. And it was a critical forum for us. We initiated the same as COSATU at the COSATU level. And then we began to develop what we called the 10-point programs of action. And that was, you know, based on the recognition that none of this was going to be a PhD or postdoctoral thesis. We certainly weren't going to win the Nobel Prize for science for rigor on every single plan. But because it was necessary to have an idea of what to do and to tackle things methodically and to provide guidance to people and to demonstrate that there was some sense of what to do and how to do it, We developed 10-point plans on things like how to deal with UIF funding crisis. I'll talk a bit about that just now. Challenges with membership, but also growing membership. As we did more of this work, more workers learned that we were doing it successfully, came to join the union. Issues on retirement funds, the vaccine rollout, et cetera, et cetera. So we produced a host of these 10-point plans. We also repurposed tools in our ecosystem. And I mentioned in the beginning, we've got a strong history of collective bargaining and bargaining institutions. So we began to roll out collective bargaining agreements quite early on as ways to support workers around income, around market access, around health. We developed in our bargaining councils a rapid response team that met twice a day for many, many, many months, weekends, etc., to be able to coordinate the response of, for example, the clothing industry to the crisis and trends which were emerging. They would draw information out of industry, infection rates, challenges on the workplace, the way regulations were manifesting at the workplace, etc. They would then develop responses across the union, across the employer associations, feed those back into the bargaining council structures. And there was the sort of dynamic of feed of information flow up and down. It also meant that in the end, the bargaining councils functioned as value-adding services to an industry and as developmental institutions rather than simply big stick wielders. In those structures in the bargaining councils, but also in the union, we've got health facilities, which I'll talk about just now, and we could begin to repurpose them. But we also in our union have a long history of industrial policy advocacy, social partnership work. We had just concluded our retail clothing and textile master plan. The concept of working collaboratively to solve problems was one we used very extensively. We knew before lockdown happened, we could see that there was going to be a crisis both on the income level and any tool to draw income from the UIF. And we could see several weeks before lockdown happened that there was no plan. And so we developed our own plan, which was then before lockdown occurred, codified in a collective agreement in the clothing industry. And that collective agreement was a tool that would allow us to use the bargaining council, the industry regulation body, as a vehicle to draw money out of the UIF and distribute it to factories through a system, where the bargaining council has very good knowledge of factories, has contacts with them, it could engage with payroll officers and try to make the receipt of money by workers over a period where essentially they weren't earning money. It could make that possible. This agreement covered about 80,000 workers, but it was based both on the recognition that we needed to facilitate payment to workers through the UIF, but also the fact that we shouldn't rely on the state. And so employers made commitments to also cover a period of income, and we fixed an income and had protections for about a 6-week period from the beginning of lockdown in March 2020. So we had budgeted there that whatever happened, we at least had a plan for workers while the state was making plans. I think as the colleagues on this webinar, maybe many citizens now know, getting money out of the UIF was a tough thing. And all over the country, there was trouble, there was challenges, there are millions of, maybe 1 million people who didn't get paid yet. And that was a major challenge for us because despite making a plan, we weren't managing to implement it. So we developed then a specific, I mentioned 10-point plans, we developed a very specific 10-point plan on how to get and unlock money from the UIF. And essentially, over the last 2 years, we've held almost 200 meetings with the UIF. That's above phone calls and emails on a very regular basis, but we meet them daily or weekly, and we've managed to unblock through that process around R1 billion worth of income support for workers. It benefited hundreds of companies. We go piece by piece by piece by piece, and we've unlocked the money that was supposed to be paid to tens of thousands of workers, both on the money from the collective agreement and then later on the COVID TERS. And it demonstrates the principle, firstly, that you can't just have an idea and rely on the idea, you've got to have an implementer. And secondly, as drudgerous and difficult as this work has been, if there was structure involved and deliberateness behind it, one could begin to make victories. And it generated trust amongst workers. Apart from income support, I mentioned that we needed to protect both the job security, but also defend the industrialization of workers, of the industry, make sure we didn't lose jobs and use the crisis as an opportunity to create jobs. So we actually had a collective agreement to that effect through the Bargaining Council, where we agreed to repurpose the industry to produce PPE. We set a target, we mobilized the industry, we identified standards so that we could try and push the bar up rather than lower it. We took a host of interventions on the industrialization side. I won't take you through it. We intervened in tenders, identified tenders, fought with corrupt companies, fought with supply chain officials everywhere, took it to the media, took it to Parliament, worked with business for SA on developing PPE capacity, etc., etc. We did a whole range of work there. But the outcome, the part of it was intended to produce the outcomes where the crisis could still benefit workers, produce new orders for them, new markets for the factories, or allow them to come back to work into factories. But part of it then was also intended to fulfill the trust that workers have placed in the union by maximizing the opportunities available to them and being able to feed that back to them. And then there's the vaccination campaign that we ran. And there we created the structure again through a collective agreement at the Bargaining Council level. That we established the concept in February internally in the union. By May, we had concluded a collective agreement. And what did it do? That collective agreement essentially said we would play a role as the trade union, as employer organizations in our industry, not just to message about vaccinations, but actually to deliver. And I'll take you through that in a moment. But we realized we have to message to counter things like myths, to counter things like fake news, to build trust, to maximize the willingness of workers to be vaccinated, etc. We built in non-discrimination facility. You can't get rid of workers if they don't get vaccinated, etc. But the main part of it was to deliver the opportunity to workers through a mechanism they recognized to be able to be vaccinated. So the Bargaining Council clinics, which I'll talk about in a moment, were certified that they could do this work from July, and we then launched it. Part of what needed to happen was to create the context for uptake amongst workers. So, as we were messaging to workers about the importance of vaccination, each time we were having trust centers, either at national level or local level or factory level, each time we had people who had trust in their constituency vaccinated, we would produce social media and pump it out to those localities so that workers could see themselves and people they recognized in the process. I mentioned that we rolled out these interventions through Bargaining Council clinics. So, that's part of the lesson here is we built on existing institutions. Our Bargaining Councils in clothing, for example, have been providing primary healthcare to workers since the 1940s, but also dental care, optical care, chronic medication provision, support, etc. We've got clinics across the country. We set up additional clinics where necessary. We've got staff, and they play a big role in the lives of workers on a daily basis. And if we could use that, which is a recognizable and easily accessible facility to workers, we stood a better chance to be able to get them to participate. But we also have health experience in my trade union. We, for many years ran a HIV, AIDS, and TB outreach program based on education, prevention, treatment, etc. And so we also had staff we could bring in and a set of institutional knowledge that we could apply to the problem. We made the vaccine accessible using capable infrastructure that workers knew and trusted. The outcome was that 80% of workers in the industry got their first jabs, 55% got their second jab, so less impressive. But overall, we did very well. We did well with staff. We got to 75% of staff and shop stewards fully vaccinated. We managed to, through the process, not just strengthen the immunity and health of our constituency, but also the facilities themselves that we geared and repurposed for these tasks were strengthened. They were given a mission, they geared up for it, etc. So let me come to the last slide. I'm aware that I've gone slightly long. Several lessons that could be drawn. I've got the elephant being eaten piece by piece, and I think that's part of it, that we maybe unrealistically expect ourselves very often to have postdoctoral theses that are absolutely right on everything that we do. And I think the point is that we commit ourselves to tackle the task and then recognize that the task may start piece by piece rather than being, socialism in one go, that's an effective strategy. The need to anticipate is important rather than simply react. We do a lot of that because we tend to talk and then not do very much. But the idea of gearing oneself for action early, scenario planning, etc., was very useful. Claiming agency, sort of moving away from the major challenge that we have across sectors, across social elements in society, where we all look to the state to deliver. But in this instance, recognizing that each social partner has agency and resources. Doesn't have to be financial resources. Those may be networks, there may be competencies, etc. We needed to claim agency. It's an important lesson. Communicate clearly and regularly. I mentioned earlier, in a context of uncertainty, people try to create meaning and certainty through whatever mechanism they can. They may latch on to myths, they may latch on to anger, they may latch on to hopelessness, they may latch on to whatever it is. But through communicating clearly and regularly, one creates at least the ability for a constituency to trust that there is a plan, and even if it's not unfolding perfectly, it is unfolding. The idea that action needs an implementer. We can't just leave it to an agreement to manifest itself. I mean, that's nonsense. That we need to build on current capacities. Maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel from scratch. What do we have? How do we use it better? And then minimize uncertainty and deliver to maximize trust. So one's got to, as I say, sort of push up the ability of people to see that there's a plan and that something is happening, and then be able to effectively deliver on parts of that plan to demonstrate that there is something. And then where people are willing to give trust, even if you're not delivering 100% of what people want immediately when they want it, the ability to see there's a plan and that there's something is happening. Our citizens are enormously generous and give themselves to that process, is what we've found. So let me stop there. I apologize for going slightly longer, but I hope that was helpful.
Simon, your presentation was so attractive that it was difficult to stop you. So we enjoyed that. You'll get the Lenin Award for presentations at the end of today's session. Well done. But I think you've brought home some really important lessons for us to take forward. And that's the question we want the participants to please post on the question and chat area. What are the lessons and legacy of this period? What can we take forward? What more could have been done? What more should have been done, etc., etc. So please keep posting. There's a lively few contributions there. And we would really love to hear you so that even the panelists can respond to some of that. So that's the one thing. I think the one graphic that I really, really enjoyed, Simon, was that of the Sisyphean task. We know how difficult it is to move society forward, let alone execute a campaign of this order. And well done in capturing the kind of work that was done. And I think some of the questions we may need to answer in the discussion is, to what extent was this spread out amongst other COSATU affiliates and other trade unions? So let's look at that in the discussion session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the last speaker on the panel, Dr. Jürgen Pillay, an old friend of mine. You can see it from his lack of hair and mine. And he'll be speaking to the questions around from the COVID pandemic towards improved public health care. He's currently with the University of Stellenbosch Department of Global Health and is a former Deputy DG at the Department of Health. Over to you, Jürgen.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks both to NEDLAC and Mr. for inviting me to participate in this webinar. As you can see, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll speak to two publications that I participated in writing. One in the South African Medical Journal and the other in the Daily Maverick. So while I will focus on lessons learned during the heady days of COVID-19, especially the first three waves, and the need to prepare for future pandemics, I'll also speak about what is needed in a social compact, given that this is partly convened by NEDLAC, for us to live in a healthy society. So moving a little bit away directly from what the health sector could do, can do better. In May this year, a large number of colleagues and I published a special issue of the South African Medical Journal entitled An Analysis of South Africa's Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic. In this issue, we wrote about the structures that were established to govern and manage the pandemic, largely, I might add, from the health sector's perspective. We wrote about leveraging epidemiology as a decision support tool. Our attempts then went through to look at how to mitigate the spread of the virus in our attempt to screen, test, track, and trace, and model the movement of people on the assumption, of course, that movement spreads the virus. We further wrote on the risk communication and community engagement processes, on lessons learned from vaccine scale-up, and David has already spoken to that, and finally on recovery and transformation of the South African health system. So those were 6 or more of the chapters that are contained in that special issue of the South African Medical Journal. On writing these chapters and the supplements, colleagues reflected on the work done in a thoughtful and open, transparent way. However, because all of the authors were involved in the response in some form or the other, one might anticipate some level of bias. However, in our foreword to the supplement, my colleagues and I wrote, and I quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic has unmasked major disparities in the health system at all levels of healthcare services and has demonstrated a significant lack of reserve capacity within the public health system to deal with disasters. It is vital that the lessons from the COVID-19 response are used to radically transform the South African health system and to prepare for future outbreaks. Our work begins," close quote. In the chapter on governance, colleagues said this in their conclusion, and I quote, "The importance of coordination mechanisms," and I think this has come up many times already, "in emergency response cannot be overemphasized. Early, decisive, harmonized coordination are key principles needed to gain public trust," again, an issue that was raised many times, "and to respond to a public health emergency effectively and efficiently," unquote. In the chapter on evidence-based decision-making, colleagues wrote the following, and I quote, "Rapid development of robust data systems was necessary to support the response. These systems produced data streams and supported development of models that were used in decision-making at all levels of government. While much progress has been made in producing epidemiological data, many challenges remain and need to be overcome to address gaps and better prepare for other emergencies." So clearly, on the collection of data in a coordinated way was a challenge. It was overcome in part, but much more needs to be done. Similarly, other colleagues noted that, and I quote, "There is a need to establish an integrated national surveillance system that is adapted and strengthened at different levels of the health system by ensuring the involvement of communities, civil society, and the private sector. Efforts to monitor and slow down the spread of COVID-19 could have been multiplied." Colleagues that worked on risk communication and community engagement acknowledged that there is a great need for bi-directional communication. I think much of our communication was top-down during at least the first 2/3 of the COVID pandemic, with greater involvement of communities and civil society. And I think David Harrison spoke to this already. And they wrote, and I quote, "Empowering communities to act, strengthening public trust and community participation, using multiple channels as well as timely responses to rumors and misinformation are important drivers of COVID-19 communication," unquote. What's fairly clear is that the lessons from our responses to the HIV epidemic were not wholly used in responding to COVID. There are 10 lessons from the vaccine scale-up program. I won't repeat any of them. I think David Harrison has noted them, but the colleagues writing in the SAMJ noted the following, and I quote, "Consistently advocate for vaccination to reduce public hesitancy, be transparent about risks and benefits, facilitate access to a range of sites, vaccine sites, leverage instant messaging platforms. Safety is paramount. Identify high-risk individuals who might be susceptible to adverse events. Be transparent about adverse events while acknowledging the small risk that there was. And flexibility and teamwork are essential in designing and implementing the vaccination program. And finally, the chapter on recovery and transformation identified the following key issues. Take care of healthcare workers. I think we didn't do this significantly well in the first 2 waves. We got a little bit better in the last 3 waves, but I think it's fairly clear that healthcare workers, like the general population, and of course, workers, as Simon suggested, were significantly traumatized by the COVID-19 pandemic. We didn't realize this soon enough, and we didn't take steps to intervene soon. Secondly, that we need to align service delivery or the provision of routine services to the different pandemic alert levels. What was fairly clear is one size doesn't fit all. The pandemic was not uniform across all provinces. As you looked at the waves by provinces, they started and ended at different times, but we assumed a one size fits all pandemic, which of course was not real. Strengthen referral pathways for essential services. Essential services in health, as in other sectors, schooling, as well as provision of social services, took a big hit during COVID. We are still recovering from the hit with respect to especially the first 2 lockdowns. Make health facilities safe and efficient. Expand digital solutions to close the gap between people and health services, and engage and empower communities. And this engagement of communities and a bottom-up approach to responses to social challenges, I think has resonated throughout these presentations and many of the other presentations that we've made. So these are the big lessons from our responses to COVID-19. However, these lessons alone will not result in healthy society. So going forward, besides responding to a pandemic like COVID, we've got to respond to pandemics like climate change in a more serious way in our country. In a Daily Maverick article that I wrote in June entitled Ensuring Access to Nutritious Food Should Be at the Heart of Ramaphosa's Social Compact, and I wrote this in relation to the President's State of the Nation address in February, where he asked that NEDLAC and all the social partners develop a social compact. I wrote about what a social compact that the President announced should actually focus on in the context of growing the economy, decreasing inequities, and reducing hunger. All of which are the backdrop of poor physical and mental health outcomes. If we do not have healthy people, we will not have a productive society. We have sky-high levels of obesity, including childhood obesity, alongside severe malnutrition and stunting. We have high levels of alcohol and tobacco use and significantly high levels of diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, and cancer. These so-called non-communicable diseases now contribute a higher percentage of avoidable deaths in our country when compared to communicable diseases such as TB and HIV. Contrary to general usage, these non-communicable diseases are not diseases of lifestyle, but should be called commercial determinants of health. In the article, I write about what I think should be done in the social compact to address especially food and the health crisis in our country. Now, I picked food because food is, and together with other things like harmful use of alcohol and tobacco use and lack of exercise, are key to developing healthy societies. We need to reduce the amount of sugar and salt that we consume, not only through health promotion messages, which relies on individual action, but on government's ability to regulate what is healthy and what is not. Fast foods, especially processed meats, are consumed in very large quantities in our countries, but are not good for the health of our people or the planet. Beef and dairy cattle, for example, produce 72.8% of methane, which was found in a study done in 2010 in our country, with beef cattle producing the bulk of it, almost 83%. We need to promote the growing and consumption of fresh fruit and vegetables, including local production to market gardens, etc. Government should use its purchasing power to procure locally produced fruit and vegetables for use in hospitals, prisons, etc. So And so should the private sector in hotels, employer-provided canteens, etc. We've got to really focus on not only the production, but also the consumption of fruit and vegetable in our country, really to the exclusion of what is harmful to the environment and the planet. The commercial food purveyors need to understand their impact on the planet through their contribution to carbon emissions, as well as the use of water to produce their products in a water-scarce country such as ours. They should also consider the extent to which they use plastic products, reduce the use of salt and sugar in their offerings, stop discounting and pairing sugar-sweetened beverages with food, and increase their offerings of tasty nutrition and nutritious and affordable food that does not harm the planet. As I conclude in the article, reducing hunger, improving food security, reducing the stress of human consumption on the planet, and growing the economy are not mutually exclusive, but can and must be complementary activities. The social compact that the president promised must ensure that it does deliver these social goods so that we can deliver a healthy society. In conclusion, as we have shown during our response to COVID-19, there is no viable economy without good health. But good health cannot be for a few. It must be possible for everyone. This means that government, the private sector, organized labor, and civil society have to work together to co-produce a healthy society, and NEDLAC must be at the center of this co-production. The role of academics and researchers must be to produce independent research evidence of what it takes to produce healthy products that do not harm the planet and that is affordable to everyone. Even though we have a long way to go, South Africa's response to the HIV pandemic showed that it is possible with the right leadership at all levels of society to generate a social response to what are generally, and I think COVID showed us this clearly, what are social problems with huge economic and other impacts. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Dr. Pillay. Really useful getting a clear health clinical insight into how we should be managing and locating that in the broader social context and social agency that we have been talking about. So, colleagues, as you've seen, we've got a number of questions that have been asked, and we are calling on one or two individuals to perhaps join us in the open mic session. We're going to start off with Matthew Parks. So Matthew, you've raised a few questions and made some contributions, but there are also questions about, was the SACTU experience widespread amongst other trade unions? Perhaps you can raise your issues and your contributions. Matthew, over to you.
No, thanks, Chippers, and apologies that I'm in a car, so driving. So hopefully you can hear me all right. So maybe, yeah, just two questions from my side. I think one to Dave. So we saw that in society, half of the people wanted to vaccinate. There was no issue. Had about half of society which just didn't want to vaccinate for whatever reasons. So my question is linked to the existing vaccines we already have in place, for polio, measles, mumps, etc., hepatitis. I mean, all the vaccines you get when your child is born. That theoretically we're required to provide vaccine clinic cards when you take our kids to school at the age of 6. But have we been assuming that people actually do take these vaccines? Or do you actually have scientific evidence that yes, people do take it? So I feel that we actually might find a significant amount of kids might not be doing it. But maybe perhaps are the lessons learned from those existing vaccines that we could import to COVID-19, to other future pandemics, about how to get people to vaccinate. And maybe other lessons from international best practice about enforcement and mechanisms, from Singapore, South Korea, where they had a much higher uptake. And then, to Simon, I mean, I think I was really, maybe I'm biased because I come from COSATU, but I was just absolutely pleased and proud of the presentation. I mean, I think SACTU, Simon and colleagues did a huge amount of brilliant work. But maybe just my question to Simon is that with hindsight, are the lessons that or the other things you would have done differently as SACTU with the benefit of hindsight, be it around UIF issues or COVID issues or health and safety issues? Then about to your question to me, do other unions, have they done the same amount of work as SACTU? If I'm honest, I would say no. Not at the same level, not at the same sophistication or comprehensive level, but there are unions which did a lot of good work. So I know SACTU, teachers union, had daily kind of media video clippings going to teachers to encourage them to vaccinate. They were quite involved in the health and safety measures at the school place. POPCRU, the police union, mobilized the leadership to go and vaccinate with the Minister of Police when they got the police officers to go and vaccinate. NUM and I think other unions in the mining sector helped, to mobilize workers in that place to do it. But it is a mixed bag, and I think that reflects upon organizational weaknesses that different unions have in different sectors. But having said that, maybe lastly, Chair, is that SACTU works in a very difficult sector, economically is very fragile, work with very low income workers, yet they managed to do very well on so many fronts. And I think that points to quality of leadership and question of building institutions, structures for many, many years that we all could really learn from. Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Hope you could hear me okay. Thanks.
You were very clear, Matthew. Thank you very much. And your video worked perfectly. Perhaps, David, you're going to kick off by answering that, and then I will ask Simon to respond as well to Matthew. And you may have seen some of the questions in the chat. If any others you wish to address, David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Abba. So, I mean, obviously, cross-country comparison is difficult because you're dealing not only with sort of different cultures across different societies, but also different age structures. And we know that COVID obviously hit older people hardest. In South Africa, of course, with such a huge youth bulge, where such a large percentage of our population are young, and are consequently really if we're honest, are not that much at risk, certainly for death from COVID. I think that was one of the things that we didn't really acknowledge up front. We treated everybody as if they were 60 and older, even though we knew that the risk of death in young people was much lower. So when we compare across countries, with South Korea or Singapore with older population structures, population profiles, population pyramids, it's difficult really to make any conclusions. I mean, Brazil is very interesting. Brazil now has, I think, has a vaccination rates, full vaccination rates of about 85%, with a fairly similar age structure. So it is interesting to ask why a country like Brazil has done so much better. Certainly, we know that that a country like Brazil has got a much more established and entrenched district health system, a family health system that's in place. There's very rapid local mobilization of local health services when needed in Brazil, and that probably played out. I mean, in South Africa, child vaccinations are high. I mean, we do have child vaccinations of about 90%. HPV, human papilloma vaccination in young women, lower, about 60%. So we do have some issues. That, for example, in HPV, we know we have to get to young women who are not in school. We've got to get to them in places where they are, where we have to go to them and not expect them to come to us. But I do think that generally in South Africa, we're starting off on the basis where vaccination is deemed to be normal. And I think that this was one of our problems in that we actually made COVID vaccination abnormal. In many respects, we were so obsessed with the disaster that we didn't really simply say this is just a normal vaccination, just like if you're getting if you're getting a child vaccination. I think we also we reinforced that sort of exceptionalism in damaging ways. We established a national contact center, but we wouldn't allow call center agents to contact people and say, hey, why haven't you come back for your second dose of Pfizer vaccination? We centralized information around COVID vaccination, nationally, very, very tight control, instead of ensuring that the districts and the sub-districts had access and were able to use it in as flexible way as possible. So normalizing vaccination, COVID vaccination, building on the traditions in South Africa of high levels of childhood vaccination would have made a difference. Going forward, building out our district health system, really making that functional, ensuring that it's got the agency, it's got the information, it's effective, is one way in which I think we will achieve future gains. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. There's a few questions that I'm going to raise before Simon comes in answering some of the issues that Matthew had raised. I think, Simon, if you could also look at the question that's raised, what happened to, or what will or is happening to the workers that have been fired for not agreeing to be vaccinated. And then, Mabalane, if you could look at the question raised about the CCF relationship with community health workers, I think that'll be an important one. And then I think if we could also look at the all of us, or any one of us, could answer questions around how do you deal with fake news and the whole issues around people spreading stories around vaccination. Then Ila Gandhi raised the question, well, if those that were working and were earning a salary, if they were not traveling, did they manage to save money? Did they end up employing others, or what did they use the money for? And then the question by Mark Brits, also an interesting one. Here's from the Banking Association and ask, what does this mean for future vaccination? And for example, flu and so forth. And then again, I think a question that could be raised across the board. How useful would social compacts be to bringing down corruption? So I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to speak. Mabalane, I see you on the screen, so maybe we can start with you, and then Simon, and then Jürgen.
No, thanks, Abba. The relationship with the community health workers, straddled a number of areas. One, some of them were providers of services within a government vaccination program. And there's been a call, and there was a call to increase the number of such community health workers. But also there were issues behind the scenes around absorbing them into the system. When COVID started, quite a number of community health workers were recruited to provide entry-level support, especially in terms of promoting non-pharmaceutical interventions. But those that were part of the health system, as we know that the vaccination was done by the nurses or enrolled nurses. I think, for us, it's the interaction with them to ensure also that they understood their role in being part of the supply side, to ensure that when community members are mobilized and the services are actually required, they are available. They understood that we had a challenge, and although these issues were raised on the other side from labor in terms of the employment conditions, some of the VUMA vaccination drives required that we do activations on weekends, and issues around extra pay for that work rendered over the weekends. But it was an ongoing engagement that embraced the role of the community health workers in the health system, including during the heightened period of responding to the pandemic. But yeah, in the main was that we are all seized with a challenge, and we need to do what we can with what we have where we are, without trampling on people's constitutionally enshrined rights. Thanks.
You don't get away that easily, Mabala. There's a question about fake news, and it's not obviously not only specific to community constituency. How do we deal with this going forward?
Yeah, dealing with it, I mean, going forward, I think one part is the peddlers of fake news. There were those that, had a particular belief and used this opportunity to continue to advocate for their views. So they came from a position of, a deep sense of belief. And then there were others who were just playing around. I mean, we know social media has great influence in South Africa. People have various WhatsApp groups, Twitter, Facebook. They've just become platforms for people to be naughty. And some of the fake news that was peddled was people just playing around. But others, they don't decipher those messages, because then they get blown around and then they sort of become the gospel truth because of people's lack of information and knowledge. But they were mainly dealing with people's fears as well. So part of how we deal with it is in our spaces, to continue to engage with people's consciousness, to ensure that they understand what is right from what is wrong. Part of our demand generation efforts included dealing with fake news, head on, because to win someone over whose fears had been exacerbated by this fake news means that, we would have done a great work in conscientizing a person about lies that were peddled around. So it's really engaging with people's consciousness and not to be shy, to sit there, listen to the nothingness in their issues in order to win them over, not to dismiss them, to hear them, so that together we can move to the other side. So it's really not hiding, it's being out there, and we can't deal with it by only sending counter correct information. It's being on the ground and speaking to people, because people-to-people engagement for us proved much better than our efforts in terms of media and communications. Of course, media and comms is needed, but if it is not supported by, on the ground utilization of the networks that exist of traditional leaders, faith leaders, leaders across the board, limps. But when we are there and not running away, not dismissive, we're able to deal with it. Thanks.
Thanks, Babalani. Simon Apple, let's have you. There's several questions that I've asked you to respond to. So over to you.
Thanks, Chair. In the very, very, very likely event that I forget to answer a question, I'm very happy that you just tap me on the shoulder and tell me what it is that I've forgotten. Matthew puts a couple of really unpleasant questions to me. What would we do differently in SACTU, given the opportunity? And there's possibly two areas. I mean, maybe with more reflection, I'd have others, but maybe our interventions with the UIF. I described a system in which we tried to, have a upfront belt and braces approach to making sure that workers had money for at least a 6-week period through a collective agreement with the UIF. And, despite many years of engaging with the UIF and knowing the challenges with it, we believed that the tool that we had identified would sufficiently mitigate the risks that would arise essentially with the UIF being overwhelmed come April, late April, etc. And the tool that we identified was the right one. I mean, I certainly wouldn't change the collective agreement, but with all the challenges that arose from the UIF, non-payment to workers, etc., which was widespread, we took about, 10 months or so to shift our approach. What we initially did was on a daily basis, multiple times a day, feedback through email to the UIF where challenges were existing. What we did then, come the new year, is instituted daily and then weekly meetings with the UIF, building on a program going case by case by case. So, I think with the benefit of hindsight, it was almost unimaginable to us beforehand that we would have to sit with colleagues in the UIF in such a structured manner beforehand to problem solve the crisis faced by workers not getting their UIF money. It wasn't imaginable beforehand. Now, knowing the system better, I think we should probably, I would, if we could, have done that earlier. It may have allowed us to unblock things beforehand. It just didn't occur to us that we would have to have such a structured engagement with them. The other place that maybe, this is a personal interest and this is going to laugh at this, I'm sure, or maybe even predict it. Maybe I would have taken a different role in relation to PPE. So we ran a massive intervention trying to ensure that the PPE that was produced in the country, which would mean instead of relying on imports, we could activate local factories, get them to produce the PPE, unblock certain challenges that they need, and essentially provide workers with an income faster and more workers with income. You know, Comrade Tony, myself, Matthew, were engaging on a daily basis, 18 hours a day across the state at one stage, trying to determine what they were buying and whether it was being made locally. And I think, we suspected that there was corruption. We were hearing rumors of it. Certainly, we were being met with deep intransigence from supply chain officials. But the way that we tried to deal with it was within governments, calling up provincial governments to their senior executives, trying to bring in other departments. In retrospect, I may have changed strategy beforehand and tried to create a different kind of pressure on government to make sure that we tried to address the PPE problem. But I don't think we realized the scale of corruption going on there. There's some questions around what's happened with non-vaccinated workers. Look, in my industry, in clothing and textiles in particular, it hasn't been a massive problem. We built into our collective agreement that workers could not be dismissed for not taking the vaccination. So there hasn't been a major crisis there, but there certainly have been instances of workers being fired in some of the other industries where we operate for not being vaccinated. And there you sort of take it on and you challenge it on a case-by-case basis and try and win it. Obviously, I think it was a much bigger problem in other parts of the economy. And there, I can't unfortunately give a decisive answer about it. I see a question around, what can we do around social partnership and corruption? I think it's a really, really critical one. I don't want to excuse corruption at all, but part of the extent of it must be a loss of moral fiber, and part of an extent of it must be a consequence of gaming the system in order to create opportunities where one believes the market doesn't deliver, can't deliver, won't deliver. So not only are you trying to step on the head of someone else, but there's an intrinsic sense and belief that the market can't and won't deliver. And I think we need to really tackle this problem as social partners. We are doing some work at NEDLAC on trying to amend the procurement legislation. And in fact, we've got, I think, what may be the most positive experience on procurement-related and tender-related discussions that I've seen in a decade of doing this work. Some real deep thinking. I don't want to say it's going to develop and deliver anything wonderful, but I do think for the first time, the nature and the scale of the problem that we've witnessed, we're witnessing a greater sense of the urgency and crisis around procurement and corruption and the deep levels of absolute staggering piggery that has occurred. And one can see it in the engagements of colleagues. But I think key abiding lesson of COVID: don't rely on people sitting in rooms somewhere to come up with things. We need to be mobilizing, organizing people around campaigns to shift the direction of the country. One of the questions is how do we take this experience and build on trust? And I think I understand that question correctly. We've now come to a state where all of this work was happening, all this engagement, all these networks being built, partnerships being forged, etc. What can we do? And I think that maybe, and I admit in having missed this, that may be one of the major things that has come out of this. During COVID, certainly in the world in which I operated, we witnessed people coming together who didn't normally come together seeking to try to solve problems together. across the board. And it was a fairly remarkable instance of both the passion the South Africans have for their country and the capacity and talent that exists. And I mean, I think it is a critical thing then to put down into the lessons. How do we build on that? I'll give you a really, really practical example, which is outside of vaccinations and health. During the COVID crisis, we had so many factories in distress. And my task in my trade union is partly to help workers prevent job losses. So PPE is a part of that, building supply chains is a part of it. But part of the work, we had so many factories in distress, we just started networking with professionals and experts in this across the economy who could be drawn on to provide assistance to companies as and when needed. And those kind of partnerships, we continue to pull on. So, recently there's been a really big retrenchment announced in the media. It's just been sort of pushed back by 12 months. It involves, a number of thousands of people. And although we're not involved in that, we don't represent workers in that company, my particular union, we've been providing assistance to other trade unions, partly using those networks that we've, helped to establish under COVID, bringing in people with ideas, identifying opportunities, etc. So sort of cluster around support to essentially, 4,000 workers who stood to lose their jobs. The outcome of that process is workers won't lose their jobs. Now, it doesn't arise directly from those COVID relationships, but some of the actors in the COVID experience, some of the partners were brought on board in a little bit of a supportive capacity in the background to provide some guidance, to generate some trust, to generate something of a plan among some of the actors. And it may not be the only reason there was success in any shape or form. I don't want to pretend it was, but it contributed to a sense of we can do this. This doesn't have to be a crisis. It will be a crisis if it's not solved, but there's a path to victory. And so, my firm belief is we can and should be mobilizing those networks because that's one of the major opportunities and lessons coming out of COVID. Collaboration and networking. We should be mobilizing those in multiple spaces across the economy and across our society. There's a question, sorry, let me take the last one. How do we get more unions? I think Comrade Tony says this. How do we get more unions to do this kind of work? The kind of work that I've articulated. And this is a tough one and I need to answer it carefully. A lot of times the crisis that working class South Africans face is so large that trade unions become overwhelmed by the crisis management that they do on a daily basis for workers at the factories or companies that they represent. And it often impedes the ability of unions then to do the next thing. What we had in the 1970s in South Africa with the reemergence of the progressive trade union movement was the influx of young professionals coming into the movement and bringing a set of skills beyond necessarily just factory-based problems or company-based problems or plant-based problems. And I don't see a lot of evidence that the movement has managed to continue to draw that kind of talent from outside its ranks back into the movement to build the kind of supplementary pieces of work that unions do. And I think that would be a massively beneficial thing, that more unions draw on more forms of talent to be able to expand the ways in which they can offer services to workers and the kinds of work that they do. But that's not just about workers, that's not about unions drawing that talent. Part of the challenge is that many young progressives, people with sort of aspirations to do something in society, don't see the trade union movement as a home for their aspirations. There may be several reasons for the problem there, but as a key piece of work, that feels like something that should be and could be solved. Making the union movement a home for aspirations, a vehicle for expressing some kind of aspiration to a better world. And really, taking the capacity to organize and to deliver to workers to another level where it could be. So let me stop there so that I can get off my soapbox. Thanks.
No, we don't mind you on your soapbox, Simon. Well done. Thank you for your thorough and comprehensive responses. We're going to be in the final stretch, so I'm going to call upon a real veteran of the struggle, Ila Gandhi, former ANC MP and now a very strong community activist. Over to you, Ila.
Thank you so much, Appa, for giving me this opportunity. One of the questions that concerned me is that whilst we talk about social compact between organizations, I think it's very important to talk about social compact between people, the community as a whole, people and people. And this is one of the things that was raised by, for instance, Pope Francis, when he talks about the economy of solidarity. And it's solidarity between people and people, you know. So on that vein, what I would like to ask is if there is any research that has been done by any institution on how people who saved money because they didn't have to travel to work or didn't have to travel at all by being at home all the time, and whether that money was, given to perhaps domestic workers who wouldn't be able to go to work and things like that. You know, other groups as well, like, beauticians who wouldn't be able to operate their businesses and little informal businesses and so on, because that would be community to community. And going forward, we are told that these kind of viruses will be with us for a long time. And therefore, we need to begin to look at how we're going to cope with these issues in the future. One of the ways is to look at how communities can be helpful to others, how individuals could be helpful to other individuals. So thank you. That's my question about the research. Thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you, and thank you for gracing the occasion with your presence as well. So colleagues, I'm going to ask our panelists to, in 1 minute, give us a takeaway. And I'm going to do it in the same order that they spoke. So David Harrison, and then Mabalane, and then Simon Epple. And then Lisa, I'm going to ask you also if you wish to give a 1 minute plug for anything that you'd like to take away. But can I ask those that are the panelists and hosts, if you can just switch on your camera for 30 seconds so that the organizers can take a group picture. Okay, there we go. Ila, please put on. Matthew, you as well. You can't hide away. Lisa, Noma, Nolwazi, Pongani. Let's see you. So take a nice group picture. Bangani, we don't see your screen. Nalwazi. Okay. Smile, say cheese. Okay, great. Okay, David, let's start with you. A 1 minute last takeaway from today's session.
There's a very interesting book that speaks about the concertina of time, that in a crisis, what we see is sort of a compression. It seems like time is compressed, as if it's part of a concertina, and at that time, new opportunities created, new possibility opens up, and we've heard it a bit how we saw unusual collaborations, unusual partnerships coming into play, how it accelerated, for example. Those of us who were seeking to increase some local production of PPE, how it created opportunities of doing things differently in the economy. How, for example, when we were trying to deal with young people and the social media challenge, giving young doctors who are unemployed, post-community service doctors who are sitting around doing nothing, how giving them a platform and making them the champions on social media actually opened up new opportunity, new ways of engagement. And so we do need to be cognizant of the opportunity that disaster creates, the opportunity to build new precedents, new pathways of doing things. What we know, and we've heard it time and time again, is today is that without that local organization, without an effective district health system, without effective district municipality all of the national efforts ultimately run out of steam. And so as we prepare for the next disaster, we don't know what it's going to be, continuing to build that local infrastructure, the local partnerships, the local solidarity that Ella has spoken about is absolutely fundamental if we're going to do better next time.
Thanks, David. I think that's really useful reminder. Also, comrades would remember Lennon said something to that effect as well. When a few minutes can feel like a decade and a decade can feel like a few minutes. So over to you, Mabalane.
No, thank you, Abba and colleagues. I think for us, being able to develop a strategy enabled us to navigate the path that we didn't know which streets it will lead us into. And at every turn where we made missteps, we're able to, come back, look at the strategy, re-strategize again, and create, new paths going forward. But we're also able to embrace and work with others so that we achieve the common good, which was to respond to COVID in the best way that we possibly can. So, and those that were the glue, I mean, Lisa, we speak very less of you, but every week you made sure that we have the NRTT meetings. You pushed us to come back, report, but also to do the work and share it. And that is, most appreciated. I think, as you have said, the Solidarity Fund, we wanted more, but the little that we got was enough to propel us to do as best as we can. So yeah, we will be ready, better prepared, and we will document our lessons so that those that come after us are able to move forward and do better than we have been able to do. So like I said, when the story is told by others, there will always be a footnote about how organized and how engaged we were as civil society in our diversity. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Simon, over to you.
Thanks. A very popular thing to say, I think. We appear to suffer from the belief that every time something goes wrong, we need to rethink smarter about it and have a better policy. And sometimes it may be true. And I think actually, what we do need is just to do some really hard work. It's totally unglamorous. There's nothing glamorous about being rigorous and working till 3 or 4 in the morning, day in and day out. But it's a hell of a lot more effective sometimes than, redebating new policies. And that, I think, is the major lesson, which is, we've got an enormous wealth of talent in this country. We have a fantastic set very often of policies. Are they always of our choosing? No. Do we negotiate with ourselves and choose all the policies that we want based on our ability to do it? No, we have to make sacrifices and compromises sometimes. And we must continue to debate new policies. But really, we need to do a lot more doing. I think that's the major lesson out of it, or the major takeaway. It's not glamorous, it's hard work, but it's absolutely necessary. And hopefully, my sense is that more colleagues begin to, move away from sort of the limelight and the microphone, and just find some of the joy in being able to do. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Very important. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to all of those who contributed. So I have got 4 words, which I think encapsulate some of the messages of this webinar. The first is the importance of trust, as opposed to a language of war, which is, I think, what David said. The second is the issue of strong leadership, which really is what I think somebody said, action needs an implementer. It just struck me that none, and maybe I'm being a bit controversial here, but none of us have spoken about the role of the family meetings, and which was quite big, and we all spent a lot of time with bated breath waiting for the next family meeting, as a reflection of leadership. But definitely strong leadership is important. The third is the issue of organization, and that communication without organization is not going to take you where you need to go. And part of organization is collaboration and networking, which I think what Simon has shown us can work very effectively, that there's many new atypical forms of organization. And then the last thing is, which again we haven't talked about, but I think is implicit, is that fighting COVID, we had a common enemy, and that brought a lot of us together that otherwise may not have come so easily together. But I suppose the South African challenge at the moment is we could come together because we had a common enemy, COVID. Can we come together with a common vision going forward? Thanks, Abba.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the colleagues, everyone that has remained. Thank you for the panelists. This is one of those few meetings where we had more people joining in as the meeting proceeded. So thank you to everyone that made the contributions. I think for me, the main takeaway has been that, and I think Lisa, you captured it, COVID-19 was the enemy. It's a long time since we've seen this level of mobilization across constituencies, communities, vertically, horizontally. I think last seen maybe in the 1990s or late 80s when they're fighting apartheid. So this has set a basis, I think, that we can overcome some really major challenges. And I think the suggestions that have been made that we need to capture the voices and experiences that we've been through is very important. I think we need to look at how, if we can try and retrieve the trust that people had at the point when they were looking at how we respond to this together. I think that's an important one. I think most importantly is just the sheer numbers of people that were involved. And if we can one day capture that, as Mabalani is saying, in our history of this period, I think we'll be doing ourselves and future generations a big favor. So siyabonga kakhulu, shukran, baie dankie. Thank you very much. Take care and see you at the next webinar. I think it's going to be just as exciting. Thanks to all of you.
Danko.
Bye.